Good. Thank you, Tianhong, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. And thank you for the invitation to participate and to share some thoughts on the space market, building the market out. So what I'd like to relay is a little bit of the underlying motivation for entering the space resources market, and some suggestions around the approach to take to ensure a successful venture. Well, firstly, what are the reasons we push out into the solar system and space ultimately? Well, I believe it's participating around three main drives. The first is to ensure a life insurance policy for humanity, removing the existential risk of one planet, one planetary body, for which gives us still leaves us exposed to vulnerabilities to existential crises. The second reason is to use the resources of outer space to improve life on Earth, both from an energy perspective and a resources perspective. Ultimately, products sourced and manufactured in space may provide a significant advantage to life on Earth. And energy and industrial processes generated in space can relieve a lot of that toxic industrial production from the Earth's surface. And thirdly, simply opening up the frontier to expand into the solar system and beyond, to rekindle that exploration spirit that we have for the last 100 years, let's say, geographically held a mature configuration here on Earth. That 1 or 2% of the population that looks to expand out should have that opportunity to do so. So one of the challenges, especially with space entrepreneurs, and I include myself in this from a lot of hard-won experience. One of the challenges is that our dreams and visions for what we might understand to come to pass in the space industry in the next 10, 20, 30 years, those visions, expectations and projections don't necessarily make a business. And so the first principle to really get to grips with is that a vision model is not a business model. What one has to do is to translate that vision into a mission that is executable. And that executable mission can then be undertaken in a step-by-step basis that meets the rules of present-day economics. And the challenge is that for a lot of space resource-specific operations, we have to base our business models around some pretty extreme assumptions, and let's say a high degree of projection. So it is important to be clear about the mission and your vision when you're setting up a space resources company. Build the most exciting project you can imagine, and base it on, as I said, specific business operations and processes. Now, the relationship between that vision and business model can change for different, let's say, levels of market maturity. So if we understand that traditionally for space resources, the vision and the business models are separate, well, there are examples that I think causes some of the errors in space resource startups and planning for business ventures, in that we make assumptions that, well, the vision model is the business model. Now, that is actually accurate, or that can be accurate in very mature markets. So today, in automotive, aviation, software, furniture, cell phones, anything you can imagine for present day end-to-end markets with closed market chains, beyond the second inflection on S-curve, on the business S-curve, it is fair to say that a vision model can overlap greatly with a business model. But that is in mature markets. The vision model can also partly overlap with the business model in semi-mature markets, or markets where there is still a lot of emerging growth, and potentially between the first and second inflection point. So there's still we're still in an exponential growth phase. The markets have not yet matured by any means, and even maybe still nascent to some extent. But customer and supply chains are clear. End users are identified, and contracts are in place. And we see that with launch and communications, excuse me, Earth observation and microgravity, and potentially a very, very nascent field of manufacturing, which arguably may still be pre-first inflection. But where we're getting to in the space resources sector is well beyond the geostationary orbit facing outwards. It's quite fair to say that there is no market today. There are no customers specifically today that are putting money down on sales contracts for resources of any type. Now, that is on the verge of changing, and the change will come rapidly when it does. Once the floodgates open, there will be a revolution in how we undertake the utilization of resources, the potential customers, and the positioning for the purchase of those, what will initially be very highly sought after resources. And this is where we are starting to get into the field of space resource utilization and market dynamics. There is no, as I said, there is no existing customer base, yet there's a lot of identified potential markets and a lot of interesting conversations going on right now. And we're talking about lunar ice extraction for the use of water for life support, but more predominantly locked hydrogen for propellant, regolith processing, both in situ on the lunar surface and for product manufacturing for in space, and fabricating different structures and systems, and asteroid mining that may be required sometime in the future. So approaching the market chasm for a space resources business, there are many ways of how to overcome this. There are a number of companies that are going directly to lunar and even asteroid business models, and there is increasing success in that. But going straight for a pre-market domain leaves an organization vulnerable and exposed. So one approach that can be of interest is to actually start off on Earth. Build a world-class team for your product development here on Earth, on the Earth's surface. And that can be related to any number of fields in terms of systems engineering, sensing, processing, materials processing, mining, robotics and automation, or flight. The transferability of so many technology fields is very high. So starting with terrestrial business and going to space business can provide a lot of safety as you build that business going forward. It may be well true that this decade, going direct to a space resources business, as the market starts to mature, will then be the dominant approach. So this early positioning allows the establishment of know-how and building up know-how, but the field is moving fast. So be ready that when, let's say within 2, 3, 5 years, much more development work is going on, direct to space resources business opportunities will increase. But irrespective of whether you build your space resources company from a transition, expanding outwards, or direct to domain, the principles of sound business will provide a strong advantage if you follow them. Maintaining as many revenue generating business lines as possible and as appropriate, so that you can start generating revenue within 36 months of a new product or project, will really establish good practice in the company, encourage lean processes and operations, and force you to engage with customers to ensure that you're providing the end-to-end service or the supply chain component of your service that the market really wants. I think very important over the next decade is to optimize for cost to service, not mass to orbit. The era of mass optimization for launch vehicle transit to low Earth orbit, I believe will come to an end within the next decade. Launch vehicles like Starship and others that offer full reusability with autonomous launch and re-landing on Earth will change the entire nature of what will be possible in space. And that means there will be lots of competition. There will be lots of solutions. The financial barriers to entry will plummet. So you must establish differentiation. Just being first to market in a massively growing market is an advantage, but quickly that advantage can be overcome by superior service. So keep changing, keep growing, keep challenging your own product sets as you develop your new projects. And as the market chasm closes and we get into an emerging market rather than a pre-market, that really is a new era for space resources businesses. And the final, excuse me, the final principle I'd like to get across is that the space resources industry is a moving target. Planning product pricing capability based on current assumptions is likely to be dangerous. What you need to do is to project ahead project fully ahead to ensure that you are really planning your business to be competitive against the changing dynamics of what the especially the transport segment will be in, say, 5 to 10 years' time. And here are a couple of examples of what I mean by that, and I'll just talk you through this right now. So here is some modeling that I've undertaken previously on in a solar system economics of pricing, for example, water for propellant sourced from the moon. Now, in blue, what we have is the price of lunar water being sold in low lunar orbit. And in red, the price of terrestrial water being sold in low lunar orbit, so all the way up to the lunar surface. So at all times on the left slide, if you don't have a reusable launcher, basically what the left-hand chart is identifying is that, of course, propellant sourced from the moon is going to be always a better economic proposition. It's going to be a lot cheaper than transporting it all the way from Earth. But this left-hand slide is, for non-reusable launch, is becoming more of a historical anecdote. Ironically, this was the kind of model assumed for at least a few decades, up to maybe five years ago. But where we're really looking for, is the figure on the right, where fully reusable launch can actually become reasonably competitive or enable Earth-sourced resources to be competitive to some space-sourced resources. So in the right-hand slide, what is indicated in the model here is that with a fully reusable launch system to low Earth orbit, such as Starship, the pricing all the way in lunar orbit is actually reasonably competitive, even to transport it from Earth to the lunar low lunar orbit. Ultimately, of course, in blue, the price of lunar sourced water is always going to be better, but at low lunar orbit, there is let's say a stronger argument that needs to be made in the early stages. And so the key about this is the market on-ramping timing. That for a period of time, propellant with a fully reusable launch system to low Earth orbit will remain competitive anywhere in cislunar space for a specific amount of time. It's a very important point to recognize and understand, because LOX hydrogen propellant is seen by many as the first use case of in-space resources. With fully reusable launch vehicles, the advantage of those is delayed. The economic advantage is delayed by a few years, not too many years. We're seeing around 2027, 28. So towards the end of the decade, as scale grows, it then becomes, of course, important and necessary to establish lunar-sourced propellant manufacturing. But the key is to remain competitive and to win in the transition. In the same way, for low Earth orbit, the potentially closer to home market, the discussion becomes a little more interesting as well. So lunar sourced, excuse me. If we're looking at lunar source propellant sales in LEO, they can become competitive at scale by 2027 compared to terrestrial water sales. But that requires significant infrastructure and is it's always going to be the case in many ways that non-reusables are not going to allow this progress to be made. However, if you look at the right, with the fully reusable launch, lunar source propellant is competitive against Earth source propellant in LEO in around 2034. So when one considers that the majority of use for in-space propellant may be closer to Earth, this pushes back the competitive advantage for lunar source propellants even further, which does imply that what we have to do is to understand and construct much more advantageous business models for sourcing and providing the lunar source propellant. We need to establish the transport supply chains, the processing at scale, and the availability throughout the cislunar space to customers with the needs for transport of a spacecraft from LEO to GEO or to other locations and back down again, to change the economics of in-space transportation significantly enough so that the scale of lunar source propellant then becomes the real advantage in business model for in-space operations. And this is the same model for any market-making business. What we're doing in cislunar space as we approach the moon and other locations, asteroidal locations in the further future, is actually making markets. So the race is on, and reusable low-price launches change everything. As the prices of launch drop, the launch price of terrestrially sourced propellant and any other product also drops competitively. It is the scale, it is economic scale and growth of a massively growing emerging market that changes the intersection point of when in-space resources become rapidly more competitive. And that point is inevitable. It will inevitably come. The question is, when does it come? How quickly does it come? And what are the business models that can then dominate to remain competitive against Earth-sourced materials in that transition phase that is stimulated by reusable launch vehicles. So that period of transition, I estimate to be around 5 to 10 years. So we're looking at really being economically competitive around 2030, plus or minus. And how we get to the end of this decade and the companies and providers and the supply chains that are established will likely set the precedent for the subsequent decades. And so as you build your business, keep going step by step. Whatever happens, the key is to keep things running, keep learning, keep growing, and keep building capabilities. and go step by step into the new market frontier. So with that, thanks very much, and look forward to joining the discussion